The great river slept quietly beneath the pale moonlight, waiting to unleash its devastating fury upon the unsuspecting towns scattered across the expansive and vulnerable southern delta landscape. In the early spring of 1927, America faced an unprecedented natural disaster that would expose deep social divides and alter the course of modern national history. For months prior to the catastrophe, heavy rains pounded the central states without mercy, swelling the vast network of tributaries that fed the mighty Mississippi River water system. Engineers had built massive earthen walls to control the relentless currents, confidently assuring the frightened public that their modern constructions would easily hold back the rising muddy tides. However, nature harbored a darker intention, testing the arrogant limits of human engineering while ominous storm clouds gathered above the fragile levees protecting countless innocent lives below them. Through the month of April, the continuous downpour saturated the earth, turning the rich soil into a heavy swamp and raising the water levels to absolute critical danger. Desperate men worked through the night under the flashing lightning, stacking heavy sandbags against a roaring current, hoping to prevent the inevitable destruction of their quiet farming communities. Rumors spread quickly among the frightened laborers about small cracks appearing along the base of the protective barriers, whispering of a hidden threat lurking beneath the turbulent surface. The massive pressure of the swollen river eventually became too great for the weakened soil, leading to a catastrophic structural failure that nobody could have fully anticipated then. On the morning of April 21st, the levee at Mound's Landing suddenly surrendered, violently tearing open the land and releasing a terrifying wall of rushing brown water. The deafening roar of the initial breach echoed for miles, sounding like a continuous thunderclap that permanently shattered the peaceful morning silence across the entire flooded southern basin. Millions of gallons poured through the widening gap every single second, carrying away massive trees, heavy farm equipment, and entire wooden houses with absolute ruthless and terrifying efficiency. Panicked residents scrambled toward higher ground as the dark waters rapidly consumed their fields, wiping out generations of hard labor in a matter of a few terrifying moments. The violent floodwaters quickly expanded across an area roughly the size of New England, submerging thousands of square miles beneath a deep and toxic sea of churning mud. Communication lines were instantly severed, leaving isolated towns completely unaware of the approaching catastrophe until the freezing waters forcefully smashed against their fragile doors and shattered their windows. Railroad tracks vanished beneath the aggressive deluge, trapping countless passenger trains in remote locations and cutting off vital escape routes for thousands of terrified families seeking immediate safety. Trapped survivors desperately climbed onto the fragile rooftops of their floating homes, watching helplessly as dead livestock and broken debris drifted past them in the violently swirling currents. Rescue efforts were incredibly slow and unorganized, relying entirely on small wooden skiffs navigated by brave local volunteers who risked everything to pull freezing victims from the water. The destruction was not merely an accident of harsh weather, but a glaring revelation of a deeply unequal society, where some lives were valued significantly more than others. Wealthy plantation owners used their substantial influence to ensure their own properties were strictly protected, often forcing poor tenant workers to maintain dangerous levees at absolute gunpoint. When the massive earthen structures finally collapsed, these vulnerable laborers were completely abandoned to the rising tides, while the rich quickly evacuated on specially chartered private steamboat vessels. Tens of thousands of displaced individuals were forcefully gathered into cramped refugee camps located strictly along the narrow remaining strips of dry elevated land bordering the flooded river. Conditions inside these isolated camps were absolutely miserable, plagued by severe food shortages, rampant disease, and harsh military enforcement that prevented innocent people from seeking safety elsewhere independently. Armed guards heavily patrolled the muddy perimeters, treating the frightened refugees more like captive prisoners than desperate survivors who had just lost absolutely everything to the raging waters. The stark racial division became undeniably apparent as authorities systematically prioritized the immediate rescue and relief of privileged citizens while intentionally ignoring the dire needs of minorities trapped. Relief boats were strictly ordered to bypass desperate families waving from submerged rooftops, a cruel and calculated decision that resulted in an unknown number of quiet, unrecorded tragedies. The national government attempted to strictly control the public narrative, dispatching powerful politicians who proudly posed for carefully staged photographs while completely ignoring the ongoing human suffering nearby. Radio broadcasts confidently declared that the crisis was successfully contained, broadcasting completely fabricated updates to reassure the anxious nation, while true chaos secretly dominated the flooded southern delta. Investigative journalists secretly captured the grim reality, smuggling out horrific stories of immense suffering and blatant corruption that directly contradicted the official statements provided by wealthy government authorities. Newspapers eventually began printing the dark truth, revealing the deeply shocking scale of destruction and the intentional neglect that transformed a natural disaster into a massive humanitarian crisis. The muddy waters remained stagnant for several brutal months, creating a toxic breeding ground for deadly mosquitoes that quickly spread dangerous fevers throughout the deeply weakened refugee populations. Entire generations of family wealth were instantly erased, leaving proud farmers absolutely destitute and forcing them to endlessly depend on the meager charity provided by slow federal agencies. Starving animals desperately searched the barren remaining ridges for food, their mournful cries adding a haunting soundtrack to the incredibly bleak and entirely devastated southern agricultural landscape today. Red Cross workers bravely navigated the hazardous terrain, delivering essential medical supplies and modest food rations to desperate communities completely isolated by the vast expanses of stagnant water. Despite these noble efforts, many supplies were secretly diverted by corrupt local officials, leaving the most vulnerable victims completely hungry and entirely exposed to the harsh natural elements. The profound betrayal felt by the marginalized laborers sparked a quiet but powerful revolution, altering the fundamental social fabric of the entire region for many generations to come. Realizing they would never find genuine justice or fair economic opportunity in the flooded South, thousands packed their few remaining belongings and began planning a massive northward escape. Trains previously used to transport cotton were now completely filled with exhausted families heading toward northern industrial cities, seeking a completely new beginning far away from the river. This massive demographic shift profoundly transformed urban centers like Chicago and Detroit, introducing rich Southern cultural traditions and dynamic new music to an entirely different Northern American audience. Blues musicians powerfully immortalized the tragedy in their deeply sorrowful songs, singing of broken levees and cruel overseers, ensuring the painful memory of the disaster would never die. As the heavy waters slowly receded during the late summer, the terrible true extent of the physical destruction finally became visible to the utterly shocked and horrified nation. Thick layers of toxic mud permanently covered what were once incredibly fertile agricultural fields, rendering the local land completely useless for any future farming operations for several years. Abandoned houses sat strangely tilted off their weak foundations, silently standing as ruined monuments to a fragile human existence that was easily erased by nature without any warning. The federal government finally acknowledged the immense failure of their previous engineering strategies, prompting a massive redesign of the entire national river control system across the whole country. Congress quickly passed sweeping new legislation to fund massive flood control projects, forever changing the environmental relationship between the federal authorities and the powerful natural waterways they managed. Despite these ambitious structural promises, the deepest scars left by the terrible flood were fundamentally human, etched into the collective memory of those who survived the terrifying ordeal. Trust in local leadership was permanently destroyed, as poor citizens vividly remembered how quickly they were sacrificed to desperately protect the massive wealth of a privileged, powerful few. Secret mass graves were never fully officially documented, leaving thousands of grieving families without any proper closure regarding their mysteriously missing loved ones swept away by the river. The dark legacy of 1927 remains a powerfully chilling reminder of our fragile existence when confronting the absolute overwhelming and uncontrollable forces of angry Mother Nature. Modern engineers continuously study the historical failures of that tragic spring, hoping to eventually prevent another massive catastrophic event from claiming so many entirely innocent and vulnerable lives. Yet beneath the incredibly thick concrete walls and modern sophisticated sensors, the old river still flows with the exact same unpredictable and dangerous energy it always possessed before. Historians heavily debate the total actual death toll, suggesting the officially published numbers were intentionally altered to minimize the embarrassing political fallout caused by the massive rescue failures. Archival photographs clearly reveal the haunting expressions of stranded victims, their weary eyes telling incredible stories of sudden loss that written official documents continually failed to fully capture. The massive floodwaters eventually reached the distant ocean, but the deeply toxic political and social residue left behind poisoned the American cultural landscape for many turbulent decades afterward. Forgotten voices slowly emerge from the dusty archives, demanding that their hidden histories finally be acknowledged by a modern society that blindly continues to repeat past tragic mistakes. We must continually remember the victims, who tragically perished in the dark, muddy waters, honoring their quiet suffering by fiercely demanding true equality and absolute justice today unconditionally. The great river slowly returned to its natural boundaries, silently holding the incredibly dark secrets of that terrible spring completely hidden beneath its rapidly flowing and muddy surface. Nature ultimately proved that no amount of advanced engineering or vast political power can permanently tame the incredibly wild spirit of the massive Southern American river system eternally. As we cautiously examine the crumbling remnants of those ancient broken levees, we are powerfully reminded of our profound vulnerability and absolute insignificance against such awesome natural fury. The story of 1927 perfectly illustrates a devastating tragedy of extreme hubris, serving as a bleak historical warning that continues echoing through the deeply scarred landscape.